September 11, 1944, the Moselle River Valley, 6 miles south of Metz, eastern France. Dawn broke and the Germans on the heights could see everything. They could see the canal running parallel to the river, they could see the strip of swamp land between them, and they could see in the gray early light exactly what the Americans were trying to build. A bridge right there in the open across 500 yards of flat ground that offered no cover of any kind. An artillery observer on the high ground southeast of the village of Arnaudville picked up his field telephone. He had coordinates for every meter of that crossing site within minutes. 105mm shells began walking across the construction zone. Engineers of the 204th Combat Engineer Battalion, some of them waist-deep in cold water, watched their half-finished treadway bridge come apart, pontoons buckled, planks splintered. Men dove for cover on a riverbank that had none. 2 days earlier, 10.5 miles north, at a village called Dornet, the same thing had happened. American infantry had crossed the Moselle in assault boats, seized a thin strip of east bank, and then died on it because the Germans on the surrounding hills could see every boat, every man, every attempt to reinforce. No smoke, no concealment. Observed artillery adjusted in real time by men with binoculars and telephone wire toward the bridge. Head apart, after 36 hours, the survivors swam back across. The Dornet crossing was abandoned. Now Arnaudville was heading the same way. Then something changed. From behind a ridge called Hill 303, 2,300 yards west of the crossing, a white haze began to rise, low at first, oily, heavy, clinging to the ground. It drifted east on the prevailing wind, thickening as it moved, filling the valley between the hills like milk poured into a bowl. Within 20 minutes, the river vanished, the canal, the swamp, the bridge site, the engineers gone, all of it, under a white ceiling that stretched from bank to bank. The German observer was still on his hill. His guns were still loaded, his map was still marked, but he was aiming into nothing. He fired anyway, blind. The shells fell into open fields, into water, into coordinates where no one stood. Below the white wall, the engineers of the 504th went back to work. If this story helps you see what these men built under fire, a like and subscribe helps it reach the audience that values it most. Now hold that image. A German gunner with every advantage firing into white nothing, because without the next piece, you won't understand why what just happened at a river in eastern France mattered far beyond one bridge. Every fortified position the Germans held on the Western Front in 1944 was designed around one capability, not firepower. The Americans had more, not armor, not numbers, sight. The ability to see the enemy before the enemy reached you. That was the operating principle behind every bunker, every pillbox, every river defense line from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. Take the high ground, pour concrete around a narrow slit. Register your guns on every road, every clearing, every ford within range, and wait. When the Americans came, you picked up a telephone and they died in the open before they reached your wire. And here's the problem American commanders had been grinding against for 9 months. Firepower code. Not solved. This, you could shell a concrete bunker for 3 hours with 155mm howitzers. The man inside survived because he was underground. The moment your barrage lifted, and it had to lift because your own men needed to advance. The observer was back at his slit, watching, calling corrections. Bombing was the same equation. The bunker held, the telephone worked, the observer returned, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the rivers of Lorraine. American infantry paid for this advantage in blood, not because the defenders were braver, not because they were better equipped, because they could see. That's what makes this story unusual, because the thing that finally broke this equation, the thing that did to German defenders what no barrage, no bombing run, no armored assault ever could, was not a weapon. Remember that phrase. You'll need it later. It weighed almost nothing. It killed no one. It disappeared when the wind shifted. And it did something to the men inside those concrete positions that 1,000 rounds of high explosive had never managed. It didn't collapse their bunker. It didn't wound the man at the firing slit. It didn't destroy a single sandbag. It made him come out. But before the Americans understood what smoke could do to a man who cannot see, before they built a system that would one day lay a 66-mi curtain of white blindness along the last river into Germany, they first had to survive a place where the enemy could see everything, every ship unloading at the dock, every truck on the single road, every ammunition crate stacked in the open. A place where German observers sat in the hills above and directed fire with the calm precision of men at a shooting range, and the Americans below had nowhere to hide and no way to shoot back at eyes they couldn't find. That place was a flat strip of Italian coastline called Anzio, and what the Germans did there to men and equipment they could see day after day, shell after shell for 3 straight months, would finally push a small group of American chemical officers to build something that had never been attempted at that scale in the history of warfare. February 10, 1944, the Anzio beachhead, central Italy, 40 miles south of Rome. The beachhead was 7 miles deep and 15 meters wide. Every inch of it was visible from the hills. The Alban Hills rose to the northeast, a crescent of high ground that wrapped round the Allied perimeter like the rim of a bowl. German observers sat in farmhouses, in church towers, on ridge lines that gave them a view of the entire pocket from the harbor at Anzio to the forward foxholes at Cisterna. They had telescopes. They had telephone wire running back to batteries of 105s and 155s dug into reverse slopes. They had the luxury of time, and every morning they went to work. A truck moved on the single supply road. Shells followed it within 90 seconds. An ammunition dump was restacked after dark. By dawn, a German observer had spotted the fresh tire tracks, and the first salvo was already in the air. A ship tied up at the harbor to unload gasoline. The harbor was registered to the meter, and the rounds came before the first crate cleared the deck. Between January 22 and March 10, the Germans destroyed over 1,000 tons of Allied ammunition at Anzio, not by assault, not by airstrike, by observation. A man on a hill with a pair of binoculars and a telephone, that's all it took. 27 tons a day on average simply erased because the Germans could see where it was stacked. And ammunition was the cheap part. The expensive part was men. In March of 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division held a long stretch of the Anzio perimeter. 83% of its combat casualties that month came from shell fragments, not from infantry attacks, not from tanks, from artillery directed, corrected, adjusted by observers who never had to guess where the Americans were because the Americans were on flat ground and the Germans were above them. This is the part you need to hold in your mind because everything that happens later in this story grows from this single fact. At Anzio, the problem was not German firepower. The Americans had more guns, more shells, more planes. The problem was that the Germans could see and the Americans could not hide. They try. 6 Corps ran a counter-battery program, 8 howitzers and a 40mm guns aimed at suspected observation posts. They demolished farmhouses on the forward slopes. They shelled church steeples. They hit everything that looked like it might hold a man with binoculars. It didn't matter. The hills were too big. There were too many places to watch from. Destroy one post and another opened the next morning. They tried from the air. Fighter bombers hit the reverse slopes where the German batteries sat. The guns survived because they were dug in. The observers survived because a man in a foxhole with a telephone is almost impossible to kill from 15,000 feet. Meanwhile, a weapon the Americans had no answer for arrived on the railroad tracks behind the German lines. The troops called it Anzio, Annie, a 280mm railroad gun that could throw 560-pound shell into the harbor from miles away. There were 2 of them. They fired, then rolled into a tunnel before the counter-fire could arrive. Every man at the beach had learned to recognize the sound. A distant crack, then a freight train roar, then an explosion that could flip a truck. There was no way to shoot back at what you couldn't find, and there was no way to hide from what could see you. Now, here is the detail that makes this story more complicated than it first appears, because the Americans at Anzio, it'd have smoke. The 24th Decontamination Company had landed on the first day with M1 smoke generators and smoke pots. They smoked the port at dawn and dusk when Luftwaffe raids were expected. It helped a little. German bombers had a harder time aiming through the haze, but that was all because the men who controlled the beachhead, the air defense commander, the artillery commander, the naval officer in charge of unloading refused to allow large-scale smoke. Their argument was simple: if you blind the Germans, you also blind yourself. Anti-aircraft gunners couldn't track incoming planes through smoke. Artillery forward observers couldn't spot their own fire. Ships couldn't navigate into the harbor if they couldn't see the dock. Smoke, they argued, would solve one problem and create 5 others. So the chemical officers, the men whose entire job was obscuration, were told to stand down, smoke the port at dawn, smoke the port at dusk, nothing more, and every day between those 2 thin windows of white, the German observers went back to their scopes and the shells kept falling. Remember the number: 27 tons of ammunition per day. That's not a statistic. That's 300 trucks worth of shells, propellant, fuses, and crates turned into scrap metal every single week by men who never fired a rifle, who never crossed a trench, who just watched and telephoned and waited for the sound of their own guns. It took 6 weeks of this. 6 weeks of daily destruction that no amount of return fire could stop before a small group of chemical warfare officers inside 6 Corps finally got permission to try something different. Not a dense wall of smoke, not the kind of screen that turns day into night and blinds everyone on both sides. Something no army had done before. Something that required a level of control over weather, chemistry, and geography that most commanders didn't believe was possible, and the man who gave the order, Major General Lucian Truscott, the 6th Corps commander, gave it for one reason: nothing else had worked. March 18, 1944, Anzio Beach hit before dawn. The men of the 179th Smoke Generator Company loaded their empty generators onto trucks and drove forward past the harbor, past the supply dumps, past the anti-aircraft batteries, toward positions no smoke unit had ever occupied at Anzio. They stopped at a line roughly 1,000 meters beyond the flak guns and 1,000 meters short of the artillery observation posts. They set up 22 positions along a 15 m arc that curved round the entire harbor like apprentices drawn in the dirt. Then they started their machines. What came out of those generators was not smoke. That's the detail that changes everything. The chemical officers had not won the argument by promising to blind the battlefield. They had won it by proposing something more precise: a calibrated haze, thin enough that a truck driver on the supply road below could still see the road, still see the vehicle in front of him, still make his delivery. Thin enough that an anti-aircraft gunner could still track an incoming plane against the sky. Thin enough that the harbor kept functioning, ships kept unloading, and 3,500 tons of supplies kept moving ashore every day. But thick enough that a German observer 3 miles away and 1,000 feet above could not resolve a single target. The difference between smoke and haze sounds trivial, a matter of density, of droplet size, of how much fog oil you feed into a generator per minute. But on the ground at Anzio, that difference was the width between life and death. Dense smoke would have shut down the beachhead as surely as German shells. The haze let the beachhead breathe and took away the one thing that had been killing it. The engineering was brutal. Wind shifted constantly on the coastal plain. A generator placed for a westerly breeze became useless when the wind swung south. So the chemical officers built flexibility into the R-22 positions, only 19 active at any time, the selection rotating with the weather. 2 more generators rode on Navy patrol craft in the harbor itself, covering gaps the land-based machines couldn't reach. Meteorological teams tracked wind speed and direction around the clock. Every morning before the generators fired, someone studied the air and decided which positions to activate. And then the haze went up half an hour before dawn. It stayed up until half an hour after sunset, every single day for 2 months. That's what the German observers woke up to on March 19th. The beachhead they had been dissecting with their telescopes for 56 days had quietly disappeared. The harbor was still there. They knew that. The roads were still there, the ammunition dumps, the trucks, the fuel depots, all of it still functioning below the haze, but from the Alban Hills. It looked like staring through frosted glass at shapes that refused to hold still. Their guns kept firing. But now the correction stopped. A shell landed to 100 meters on the supply road and no voice on the telephone said left to 100. It just landed and the next one landed somewhere else and the one after that hit an empty field. The mathematics of observed fire, which depend entirely on seeing where the last round fell, collapse into guesswork. Here is a number that tells you what that haze was worth. Before March 18th, German artillery and bombing destroyed an average of 27 tons of Allied ammunition per day. After the haze went up, that number dropped. Not to zero because blind fire still hit something, but far enough that 6 Corps stopped losing the logistics race. Supplies accumulated instead of burning. Reinforcements moved in daylight instead of crawling at night. The beachhead, for the first time in 2 months, was gaining weight faster than the Germans could bleed it. And then came the morning of May 23rd. 5,000 Allied guns opened fire before dawn. Behind the barrage, the haze still hung in the valley, thicker now, mixed with smoke from the shelling itself. Tanks of the 1st Armored Division rolled forward through the white murk, engines roaring, followed by infantry that moved in behind them at a run. The Germans in the forward positions couldn't see them coming. Not through the haze, not through the smoke, not through the dust of their own collapsing entrenchments. When the American infantry reached the first line of German dugouts, they found men who had to be physically dragged out, some with only half their clothes on, completely unready for the fight. They hadn't heard the tanks over the artillery. They hadn't seen the infantry through the haze. The first thing of them knew about the breakout was an American rifle in their face. After 125 days of siege, the Anzio beachhead was open, and somewhere in the chaos of that morning, a principle had been proven that would reshape the last year of the war. You did not have to destroy a German position to defeat it. You did not have to kill the man at the observation slit. You just had to make sure he couldn't see. But Anzio was the fence. The Americans had been stationary, surrounded, dug in, and the haze had simply hidden what was already there. The real question, the one that no chemical officer could yet answer, was whether smoke could work the other way, not to hide a position, but to cross open ground, to build a bridge under fire, to send men in boats across a river while German guns stared down from the heights above. That question would be answered in September at a river the Americans had never seen before, and the answer would come from a smoke company that for days earlier had been driving trucks. September 8, 1944, Eastern France. Behind the lines of Tatton's Third Army, the men of the 84th Chemical Smoke Generator Company received an order that day that changed their war. For weeks, they had been doing what the army often assigned its black soldiers in 1944, hauling supplies, driving trucks along the Red Ball Express and its feeder roads, moving ammunition and fuel from the Normandy beaches to the front, hundreds of miles behind the tip of the advance. Their empty smoke generators sat unused. Their training in obscuration was months old and untested under fire. 3 months earlier, the 84th had crossed the English Channel and come ashore at Omaha Beach on D+ to smoke the port against Luftwaffe night raids. They never fired a generator in anger. The bombers didn't come. The company was reassigned to hauling cargo, and that's what they had been doing ever since, now with 48 hours' notice. They were ordered to the Moselle River to support the 5th Infantry Division's crossing at a village called Arnaudville in a role they had never performed in combat. The problem was immediate and practical. Their fog oil, the petroleum-based liquid that empty generators vaporize into white haze, was sitting in the 3rd Army Supply Depot at Tuo, 180 meters to the rear. The 84th didn't have enough trucks to haul the quantities they would need, so the 5th Division's quartermaster lent his own vehicles to make the run. Drums of fog oil began rolling east on roads already choked with armor, artillery, and infantry, all converging on a river that the Germans had every intention of defending. On the night of September 9th, the company moved into position. Lieutenant Colonel Codingham, the 5th Division's chemical officer, had done something that no one at Dorno 2 days earlier had thought to do. He'd ordered a full meteorological study of the valley, wind direction, wind speed, thermal patterns, terrain effects on airflow, the kind of data that would tell him not just where to put the generators, but when the smoke would work and when it would fail. What he found was encouraging, but fragile. The prevailing wind blew west to east, straight from the hills behind them toward the river. If it held, generators placed on the reverse slope of Hill 303 would push haze across 2,300 yards of valley and over the crossing site. If it shifted, and river valleys are unpredictable, the smoke would drift sideways or pool in the wrong place. Codingham placed the generators behind the hill for a second reason. The men of the 84th had never been under fire. Putting them closer to the river meant putting untested soldiers within range of German mortars. He chose distance over precision and hoped the wind would cooperate. It didn't. On the morning of September 10th, when the haze was supposed to cover the engineers building the bridge, the wind inside the valley fractured. Two generators 100 yards apart pushed smoke in opposite directions. Pockets of haze drifted uselessly into fields where no one was working, while the bridge site sat partially exposed. German observers caught glimpses through the gaps. Shells found the engineers again, and inside the 84th, the pressure cracked something open. The company commander facing his first combat faltered. Leadership broke down at the moment it mattered most. Generators went and attended. Positions that needed adjusting stayed fixed. For hours, the smoke screen was a patchwork, thick in places that didn't matter, thin where men were dying. But here's what happened next, and this is the part that matters for everything that comes after. Other men stepped in, an officer, and for enlisted soldiers, their names went into Bronze Star citation after the battle, took control of sections that had gone quiet. They repositioned generators by hand, dragging 180 pounds of steel and all across broken ground while mortar fragments sang overhead. They read the wind by watching their own smoke and moved to compensate. They did under fire what no training exercise had prepared them for. They improvised a weather-dependent system in real time on a battlefield they'd never seen against an enemy they'd never faced. By September 11th, the screen was holding. By the 12th, it was consistent. The engineers worked behind white air. German shells still fell. You can't stop an artillery battery from firing, but they fell blind. The correction stopped. The bridge went up. On September 15, the 5th Division captured the dominating heights on the far bank. The smoke mission was over. The 84th was relieved on September 21st by the 161st Smoke Generator Company and quietly went back to driving trucks. But before they left, the Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations, the division's G3, wrote a sentence that would travel up the chain of command and change how the U.S. Army crossed every river for the R. A state of the war, he wrote, a smoke generator company must be included in making a river crossing. 8 months earlier at Anzio, smoke had been an afterthought, something chemical officers had to beg for. Now after Hernaville, it was doctrine, not optional, not nice to have, required. And the men who had proved it, black soldiers pulled off cargo, trucks and thrown into combat with 2 days' notice, would never be named in the official history of the 5th Infantry Division. But the principle they established would save more lives at the next river than any artillery. Barrage fired that autumn because the next river was the Saar, and what happened there would make Arnaville look like a rehearsal. June 25, 1944, Cherbourg, northern France. The port was ringed with concrete, German fortifications, bunkers with walls 4 feet thick, pillboxes sunk into the hillsides. Casemates with interlocking fields of fire formed an arc round the city that 3 American infantry divisions had been grinding against for 3 days. The bunkers absorbed direct hits from 105mm howitzers and kept firing. The pillboxes shrugged off 500-pound bombs. The men inside could hear the explosions, feel the concussions, choke on the dust, and then go back to their slits and keep shooting. High explosive could crack a wall, but it could not make a man leave a room he believed would protect him. So, the Americans sent something else through the slits. The 87th Chemical Mortar Battalion set up its 4.2 mortars behind the infantry and began dropping rounds onto the German positions, not high explosive, white phosphorus. The soldiers had a name for it, Willie Peter. When a WP round detonated, it didn't blast a crater, it erupted, burning fragments of phosphorus scattered in every direction, trailing thick white smoke that clung to whatever it touched, concrete, earth, cloth, skin. Each fragment burned at over 500 and could not be extinguished with water, and in the 5 seconds after detonation, the white smoke was so dense and so acid that it filled any enclosed space like a fist shoved into a closed mouth. What happened next was always the same. The men inside came out, not because the bunker was destroyed, it wasn't, not because they were wounded, many weren't, they came out because they could not breathe, could not see, and could not stay in a sealed room that had just filled with burning white smoke. They stumbled into the open, with their hands up or their hands over their faces, and the American infantry was waiting. In the battle for Cherbourg alone, the 87th Battalion fired 11,899 white phosphorus rounds into the city's defenses. Nearly 12,000 rounds from a single battalion at a single port in less than a week. And infantry. Lieutenant Colonel who worked with the chemical mortars described a method in plain language that needs no paraphrase. You put phosphorus into the position to drive them out, and when they were above ground you hit them with high explosive. He said the Germans dreaded the mortars. He said his men killed large numbers of them that way. A German prisoner interrogated after capture called the 4.2 mortar automatic artillery. He wasn't wrong about the effect. The weapon could fire 5 rounds per minute, a 24-pound shell every 12 seconds, each one capable of filling a room with white blindness, and it could do this from behind a hill, invisible, unreachable by the men it was destroying. This is the part of the smoke story that most people never hear, because when you say smoke in the context of war, the image that comes to mind is a gray curtain drifting across a river. Something passive, defensive, almost gentle, but white. Phosphorus was smoke with teeth. It screamed and it burned. It blinded and it terrorized. It turned a concrete bunker, the safest place on a battlefield, into the most dangerous, because an enclosed space full of phosphorus smoke was a space no human being could occupy, and the scale of its use was staggering. At the start of the Normandy campaign, 20% of all American 81mm mortar ammunition was white phosphorus. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army in Italy had established a standing policy. No infantry division would be committed to combat without a chemical mortar battalion attached. These weren't specialist units held in reserve for special occasions. They were standard. Every division, every assault, every river, every fortified line. The chemical mortars went in with the infantry, and the WP went in first. After the war, a German general named Hermann Ochsner, the man who had supervised chemical weapons development for the Wehrmacht, was asked to evaluate American chemical munitions. His assessment of the white phosphorus ammunition was 2 words that carried the weight of a confession: outstandingly good. He didn't mean as a compliment to the engineering. He meant that the phosphorus shells did exactly what they were designed to do. They made positions that high explosive could not breach into positions that human beings could not hold, and Germany had no equivalent, no answer, no counter. Think about what that means. By late 1944, The Americans had built parallel systems that attacked the same vulnerability from different directions. At the operational level, smoke generator companies could erase entire valleys, entire river lines, entire beachheads from German observation, turning the eyes of the defense into blind glass. At the tactical level, chemical mortar battalions could inject white phosphorus directly into individual bunkers, turning the strongest point on the battlefield into an untenable one. Both systems attacked the same thing, the defender's ability to see, to breathe, to function inside his own position, and neither system required destroying that position. The bunker still stood, the pillbox was still intact, but the men inside had left because smoke in one form or another had made staying impossible. What no one had yet attempted was using both systems together. The generators and the mortars, the haze and the phosphorus, the operational screen, and the tactical punch in a single coordinated assault on a fortified river line. That happened in December of 1944 on the banks of the Saar, and the unit that made it possible was the same company that had relieved the 84th at Arnauville 3 months earlier. The 161st Smoke Generator Company, all black, all volunteers, and about to produce but one American chemical officer would call the single biggest tactical smoke operation ever attempted. December 3, 1944, the Saar River Valley, Western Germany, 6 miles from the French border, the men of the 161st Smoke Generator Company began setting up before dawn. They worked in the dark, hauling empty generators and 53-gallon drums of fog oil into positions along the west bank of the river, spacing them at intervals calculated by a chemical warfare officer from Houston, Texas, named Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Sheps, a man who had spent the autumn studying everything that had gone wrong at Arnauville and everything that had gone right. The Saar Valley was a problem shaped by geography. The river ran through a groove in the terrain with German H-held ridges on the east bank and the fortifications of the Westfall behind them, pillboxes, bunkers, dragon's teeth, minefields, and pre-registered artillery that covered every meter of open ground between the banks. The 90th Infantry Division was going to cross that ground, and without smoke, the men in the boats would be visible from the moment they touched the water. 3 months earlier at the Moselle, the 84th had improvised a smoke screen with today's notice. Fog oil hauled from a depot 180 meters away and a company commander who broke under pressure. That was what learning looked like in September. This is what the same system looked like in December. The 161st had 9,000 HC smoke pots, 11 pounds cans of hexachlorine powder, each one capable of burning for 6 minutes and throwing a column of thick white smoke into the wind. 9,000 lined up end to end. Those canisters would have stretched more than 2 meters. Each one had to be positioned by hand, lit by hand, and replaced when it burned out, which meant a man running forward through incoming fire every 6 minutes to swap a dead pot for a live one. Alongside the smoke pots, the generators consumed fog oil at a rate that would have emptied a gas station in an hour. Over the course of the operation, the 161st fed 146. 0 gallon through their machines. That's enough to fill 7 railroad tank cars. Every gallon had to be trucked to the river, poured into drums, and carried to the generators by soldiers working in the open within range of German mortars. And while the generators made the white ceiling, 2 companies of the 81st Chemical Mortar Battalion added the floor, 20,000 white phosphorus shells in a single week, not aimed at the river, aimed at the German positions on the far bank. Every bunker slit, every observation post, every ridge where a man with binoculars might be sitting. Willie Peter round after round filling the German side of the valley with the same burning, choking, blinding smoke that had emptied bunkers at Cherbourg 6 months earlier. The 2 systems, generators and mortars, haze and phosphorus, worked the same valley at the same time for the first time in the war. The generators erased the big picture. German Corps-level observers lost the ability to see where the crossing was happening and where it wasn't. The WP rounds erased the small picture. Individual defenders in individual positions lost the ability to see the boats, the engineers, the men wading through chested water 50 yards in front of them. Lieutenant Colonel Shep, standing on the west bank watching the valley disappear, would later call it one of the biggest, if not the biggest tactical smoke operation ever attempted. A newspaper correspondent who visited the site wrote that the entire Saar Valley lay under a man-made fog. Not a metaphor. The valley from Argle to Ridgeline was white. The river was invisible. The crossing sites were invisible. The bridges going up behind the assault waves were invisible, and the German guns registered, loaded, aimed at coordinates they had mapped months in advance, fired into the white and hit nothing that mattered. The 90th Division crossed. The bridge had held. Within 48 hours, Trier, one of the oldest cities in Germany, a communications hub that the Wehrmacht could not afford to lose, was in reach. Here is what the viewer who has followed this story from Anzio should now see, because the picture has changed. At Anzio, smoke was a desperate improvisation by chemical officers begging for permission. At Arnaville, it was an experiment, crude, fragile, nearly sabotaged by wind and inexperience. At Thieser, 3 months later, it was an industrial operation. 9,000 pots, 146,000 gallons of oil, 20,000 mortar rounds, meteorological teams, preposition supply chains. A doctrine that specified where the generators went when they fired and who replaced the pots under fire. The Americans had not just invented a tactic, they had built a machine, a system that could be replicated at any river, any fortified line, any place where German eyes looked down from high ground onto open terrain. And they had staffed that machine overwhelmingly with black soldiers whom the army had initially considered fit only to drive trucks. The Saar was the proof that the system worked, but it was not the end of the story, because 3 months later, in March of 1945, the Americans and their British allies would face the last and widest river in Europe. And the smoke screen they built for that crossing would stretch so far that a man standing at one end could not have driven to the other end in an hour. What they did at the Rhine had never been done before. And what it did to the German defenders waiting on the far bank went beyond blindness. It broke something deeper. March 16, 1945. The west bank of the Rhine between the cities of Kleve and Vasil, western Germany. At dawn, across a front that stretched 66 miles from north to south, smoke generators coughed to life. Not at a single crossing site, not at a bridge or a ford or a narrow stretch of river. Across 66 miles of riverbank from the British sector in the north to the American 9th Army sector in the south, a white wall rose off the ground and filled the air above the Rhine like a second sky. Behind that wall, invisible, 1,200,000 men were preparing to cross the last river into Germany. Think about that number for a moment. 66 miles. A man driving at 40 miles per hour would need more than 90 minutes to travel from one end of that smoke screen to the other. It was the longest continuous smoke screen ever laid in the history of warfare. Nothing before it, not Anzio, not Arnaville, not Thieser, came within a fraction of its scale. The preparations it concealed were so vast that a newspaper correspondent described them as elephantine. 60,000 tons of ammunition, 30,000 tons of engineer stores, 5,500 artillery pieces, anti-aircraft guns, and rocket projectors, 37,000 British and 22,000 American engineers, pontoon bridges, assault boats, amphibious vehicles, landing craft brought over land from the English Channel, all of it hidden behind white air. And on the other side of that white air, German defenders of the 1st Parachute Army sat in their positions on the east bank and stared into nothing. They knew the attack was coming. Every soldier on the east bank knew. The Rhine was the last natural barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland, and every man in a uniform understood what its loss would mean. They had been told to hold. They had fortified their positions. They had registered their guns on every stretch of river within range, but they could not see where to aim. The American and British chemical officers had built something into the screen that went beyond concealment. They alternated smoke days and no smoke days along different stretches of the front. On Tuesday, the smoke might cover the sector near Vasil and leave the sector near Reclear. On Wednesday, the pattern reversed. On Thursday, the entire line went white. The Germans could never be certain which sector was being screened for movement and which was being screened for deception. They couldn't concentrate their reserves because they didn't know where the blow would fall. They couldn't shift their artillery because the targets behind the smoke might be real or might be decoys. For 7 days, the German defenders lived inside that uncertainty. 7 days of staring at a white wall that might hide 1,000,000 men or might hide nothing. 7 days of listening because sound carried through the smoke even when light didn't, to the distant grinding of tank treads, the thud of pontoon sections being dropped into place, the murmur of a civilization preparing to cross a river. They could hear it, they could not see it, and they could not stop it. This is what smoke did that no weapon ever could. A barrage ends, a bombing run passes, the sky clears, the dust settles, and the defender goes back to his slit and starts observing again. But a smoke screen that lasts a week, that is not a tactical event. It is a condition. The defender wakes up blind. He eats blind. He checks his ammunition blind. He sits in a prepared position that costs months of labor to build with fields of fire carefully mapped to the meter. And none of it matters because the fields of fire are white. On the night of March 23rd, the wait ended. At 6 o'clock in the evening, 5,500 guns opened fire simultaneously along the east bank. The barrage was so intense that soldiers of the 9th Army dug in on the west side, felt the ground shudder through their boots. Under the barrage and the smoke, the first assault boats hit the water. The 30th Infantry Division crossed near the village of Buddock. The 79th crossed farther south. British commandos and Highland regiments went in at Vasil and Rhine. The German defenders fired back, but after a week of blindness, their fire was scattered, uncoordinated, aimed at coordinates that no observer had verified in 7 days. Positions that should have been reinforced hadn't been because the reserves were spread across 66 miles of front, waiting for an attack that might come anywhere. Guns that should have been concentrated on the actual crossing points were dispersed because no one on the east bank had been able to confirm where the real buildup was happening and where it wasn't. By dawn on March 24th, multiple bridgeheads were established on the east bank. By nightfall, 17,000 airborne troops of Operation Varsity had landed behind the German lines. Within 72 hours, the Rhine, the river that German commanders had called the last wall of the Reich, was in a light highway. The smoke was gone by then, dissolved into the March air, invisible, weighing nothing. The generators were cold. The fog oil drums were empty. The men of the smoke companies, the 22nd Battalion with all 5 companies, committed for the first time in the war. The American and British crews who had maintained a 66-me curtain for 7 straight days were already packing up. But what the smoke had done to the men on the other side of the river did not dissolve. And what those men said they were captured about what it was like to sit behind a white wall for a week while an army they could hear but not see prepared to destroy them. That is the last piece of this story, and it is the answer to the question in the title. Go back to the beginning. September 11, 1944, the Moselle River Valley, 6 miles south of Metz. A German artillery observer sits on high ground with a clear line of sight down to the river. He has a field telephone. He has coordinates for every meter of the crossing site. He has guns loaded and waiting behind him. He has concrete under his feet and a slit in front of his eyes that gives him a view of the entire valley floor, the canal, the swamp, the flat ground where the Americans are building a bridge. He has everything a defender needs except one thing. He can't see. The valley is white. The river has disappeared. The bridge, the engineers, the assault boats, the tanks lined up on the far bank, all of it is gone, dissolved into a haze that came from behind a hill and filled the world below him like water filling a bathtub. His guns are still loaded. His telephone still works. His bunker is untouched. But his eyes, the one thing that made all the rest of it matter, are useless. Now you understand what that white wall was. Not a trick, not a gimmick, not a temporary inconvenience. It was the end of everything the German defensive system was built on. Every bunker assumed the man inside could see. Every registered artillery coordinate assumed an observer would correct the fall of shot. Every firing slit, every interlocking field of fire, every carefully mapped kill zone assumed that the defender would watch the attacker cross the open ground and die in it. Smoke removed the assumption, and when the assumption died, the system died with it. That is what smoke did to German defenders that no weapon could. A 155mm shell could destroy a bunker, but the man inside might survive, and the position could be rebuilt. A 500 lb bomb could collapse a trench, but the defenders could dig another one. High explosive attacked the structure. Smoke attacked the premise. It left the bunker standing, the ammunition stacked, the gun loaded, the man alive. And none of it mattered because the man could not see the enemy he had spent months preparing to kill. A shell destroys what it hits. Smoke destroyed what the defender believed in, the idea that preparation would be enough. After the Rhine fell, the war in the West lasted 6 weeks. Organized German resistance collapsed so rapidly that Allied logistics, not German defense, became the limiting factor on the advance. The smoke had not caused that collapse by itself, but it had taken away the last thing the German army trusted on the Western Front, the certainty that fortified ground held by determined men with clear fields of fire could slow the enemy long enough to matter. The smoke companies were deactivated after the war. The Chemical Warfare Service was reorganized. The M2 generators went into storage. The 4.2 in mortar continued in service through Korea and Vietnam. But the large-scale smoke operations, the 66-mile screens, the 15M arcs, the man-made fogs that covered entire river valleys were never repeated at that scale. The men who operated those generators came home to a country that did not know their names. The 84th Smoke Generator Company, which had held the screen at Arnaudville under fire with no training and a broken chain of command, was not mentioned in the 5th Infantry Division's official history. The 161st, which had produced the largest tactical smoke operation of the war at the Jar, 9,000 pots, 146,000 gallons of fog oil, every canister lit and replaced by hand under mortar fire, was identified in the press only as a unit manned by Negroji 1 South. Their individual names did not appear. These were black soldiers in a segregated army. They had been assigned to the Chemical Warfare Service in part because the Army considered smoke generation a support role, unglamorous, technical, far from the infantry's glory. They were given the job no one else wanted, and they did it so well that a division chief of staff wrote that no river crossing should ever be attempted without them. 3 years after the war ended in 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The men of the smoke companies were already civilians by then. Most went home to the same segregated cities they had left. Their war. The white walls they built over rivers in France and Germany, the fog oil they hauled under shell fire, the pots they lit and relit every 6 minutes while fragments cut the air around them became a footnote in a chapter that most history skipped entirely. But the bridges they hid still stand in the record. The crossings they covered still count among the war's turning points. And the principle they proved, that you do not have to destroy a position to defeat it, only blind it, remains in the U.S. Army's doctrine to this day. Every fortification ever built assumes the defender can see. Every smoke round ever fired is a bet against that assumption. The men of the 84th and the 161st and the 22nd Battalion and every other smoke company that served in Europe were the ones who proved the bet was good. They didn't carry rifles into the fight. They carried fog oil and hexachlorane and 5 3-gallon drums. And they did something to the enemy that no weapon in the American arsenal could do. They didn't break what the Germans built. They made it not matter. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it showed you something about this war you hadn't seen before, a like tells the algorithm this matters. It doesn't know the difference between history and noise, but your click does. Subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be here when the next one comes. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or your country in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, tell me about them. Every one of these stories starts with a real person.